Thank you very much. In the next few minutes, I just want to address 2 points: the financing trends from the perspective of the Global Fund, and then how we are trying to address the unmet needs that we all realize, and then how we move towards more strategic investments. So first, on the resources available, from the perspective of the Global Fund, Prasad already had some data on that. But these are the results of the respective Global Fund replenishments. We just had the launch of the fourth replenishment hosted by the US government in December last year. And the columns show you how the resources have increased from replenishment to replenishment. And actually, at the last meeting, there was a 30% increase in terms of the pledges for the next 3 years, 2014 to 2016, compared to the previous cycle. Now, while the US is clearly by far the largest international donor and also very generous contributor to the Global Fund, it is important to say here that this increase did not come from the US, it came from the non-US donors. France maintained its very large contribution, but countries like the United Kingdom, the Scandinavian countries, Switzerland, Korea increased substantially, and also Italy resumed its role as a major funder. I'm not saying that because I assumed that you would be interested particularly in the details of our replenishment. I'm saying that to address a lot of the concern that we are hearing about donor fatigue around AIDS, and that there might not be that much money available from the international community. And some of the concern might be justified, but I think we have to put that into perspective. There is still a lot of real kind of support for these programs, and even some countries are coming on board now with larger contributions, and I think we need to recognize that as well. So with this replenishment, that means we can project disbursements from the Global Fund for the next few years around $4 billion that we reached last year, and then that we are projecting for the next few years. Obviously, we have a mandate for AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, so 50% of our disbursements roughly go into AIDS, and the other 50% into tuberculosis and malaria. But now, much more important than that is, how do we target, how do we focus these investments? And the allocations to the various countries around the world following this replenishment mean that there are roughly 20% more resources available for that allocation. But we've tried very hard to make that investment, a strategic investment, and therefore you see that, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa will benefit from that, slightly higher, at a slightly higher level than some of the other regions, plus 28% for Sub-Saharan Africa. And you see the Asia-Pacific region remains largely stable in terms of our allocation. And that means what we've discussed before, we need to be much more strategic in the way how we use these resources. It's very clear that here, for example, in the region, it's an epidemic that is driven largely by key affected populations, and that's where we need to invest our resources. In Africa, you can see here that, in terms of the allocations that are increasing, we are focusing on 2 regions in particular, the Southern African region and the Western African region, where the resources will go up from the Global Fund. But there is no question that even if we realize that the Global Fund resources are only complementary to what is available from the domestic funding and from other international funders, in particular PEPFAR, there is, a big underfunded need that will remain, both in the kind of low-income, high-burden countries, but also in many of the middle-income countries with targeted populations. And that's what we have to address in the next phase, I think, much more strategically. And we've discussed a couple of these options that we have for the future. These are projections from OECD on official development aid for the next couple of years. And we can assume that basically development aid will stabilize in 2014 and for the next couple of years, and will not increase as we foresee that. That, does not take into account that there might be options for new and innovative ways also to mobilize new resources, for example, through the financial transaction tax that a number of European countries are currently discussing. And if some of those resources would be allocated specifically for development and health, there could be more resources. And I do recognize that many of the NGO and civil society groups also here at this conference are advocating strongly for this financial transaction tax and other forms of innovative finance, which we as a Global Fund very strongly support. So, but the whole theme of this session, and I think that's what we need to do, is to look into the more strategic investments. And that's what we will try through our new funding model that offers some new opportunities how we can do that. A couple of country examples were already mentioned. Prasada, you had slides on Nigeria and Thailand. This is just Kenya as one example. But the message is very clear, and David presented that as well. Know your epidemic and realize the kind of geographical variations, but also the variations in the epidemiology in different population groups. And that's what we have to address. With this kind of new funding model and the country dialogue, we have a much more kind of proactive approach to allocating the resources we have than we had before. Having said that, this is really a kind of joint effort. This is not just the Global Fund or the Global Fund Secretariat. This is a kind of partnership approach between the Global Fund Secretariat, the partners at the country level, the governments, the civil society organizations, but also our UN partners like UNAIDS, WHO, and our bilateral partners like PEPFAR. Because we need to analyze together what are the kind of epidemiological trends, where do we need to invest the money, and that then needs to translate into the concept notes that many of the countries are working on right now to submit for the funding. And finally, apart from this more strategic investment, there is this big question of domestic funding. We've seen, fortunately, that resources have gone up, that we can say now there are more resources from domestic sources than from international sources, but this needs to go up further in the next few years. Within our new funding model, we've built in some conditionalities that encourage countries to invest more themselves. We call that counterpart funding, and it depends on the income level of the country. And actually, the kind of disbursement of what we allocate to the countries is dependent on countries meeting these counterpart funding requirements. But we've also built in, for the first time ever, what we call the willingness to pay. That means if the counterpart funding requirements are met, 85% of the allocation will be released. But the final 15% will depend on the demonstration of the willingness to pay to go beyond what is actually required and to show that there are increasing resources from the domestic funding that will kind of release the 100% of the Global Fund allocation. And we are working now with many countries on actually a strategy on encouraging domestic funding, working with ministries of health also to strengthen their position vis-à-vis the political leadership in the countries, the presidents, the prime ministers, the finance ministers in particular, to make the case for an increased funding from domestic sources, because only if we combine all these resources will we be able to meet the great needs that are still out there and that we want to address together. Thank you very much.